This one is titled Music and Borders, and I mixed some very famous quotes to develop and write this poem. So, music and borders. The border lifts from her diaphragm, and Still I Rise is a melody sung by the migrant at sunset. With every string, she pulls her children into her breath, arches her back like a bridge in a song for abandonment. One good thing about music, when it hits you, you feel no pain. She makes music from being displaced. Home crumbles into song, a chorus moist with feet, waves a note to the land she is leaving through music, while home foams at the mouth with war cry. What happens to a dream deferred? It rots in a hymn begging on the streets. The father is a rolling stone thrown in with the beat. The children sing in his absence. Music is food for the soul. When the body is weak, mother pours the gospel in, with eyes sunken into songs of worship, singing for Christ to return her hymn from the streets. When the father rolls back in, mother sings to keep the peace. The border lifts from her diaphragm, and Still I Rise is a melody sung to keep the spirits high. The languages in our songs are filled with luggage carrying migrants' struggles and grief. I have a dream that one day we will sing like we are welcoming them in, because music is a continent without phobia, and one day we will learn to dance without chasing anyone out. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Thank you.
I don't know if it's how creatives communicate, right? So there'll be a gap in the proceedings. And somewhere you'll find someone going like this, but you're supposed to figure out what that means. You are a prolific artist and actor. What does this mean? Like when my people up there are going like this? Okay. So I think they're putting together, well, the film has been put together, and we're going to play it in just a moment, I believe, just to reflect the themes that will be debated today. I think what's also important is that this is not just a meeting of like-minded people. I'll tell you what I mean by that. That there is a danger in only communicating with people who agree with us, with people whose desired outcomes are the same as ours. Because if we do that, then we don't open ourselves up to learning and to different narratives. When I first learned about this issue, I thought, oh, they want to censor artists, they want to control our work. And then you listen to the debate, you read up a bit more, and the layers become undone, and you reach a point of comprehension. So that's why I'm here today. We're here to learn, and I think the organizers of this event have been very bold. They've been very bold. Amongst us today are people who hold a different view. And we are going to open the floor up for you to share your perspectives. This is not just a conversation amongst like-minded people. We will debate, we will hold our views strongly, but we will also listen to what you have to say. That's coming up later on in the program. I'm not sure, is the film ready? I'm not the MC, by the way. I just hijacked the moment now because there was too much silence. Okay, so let's welcome Professor Adam Habib, who is our host this morning. He was here yesterday launching his book. Another bold move, by the way, because to go and face your audience, the very people who disagree with you, who are cross that you wrote your memoir, but in writing about ourselves, we also inevitably write about other people. And I truly believe that a plurality of voices, opening up the space, hearing, listening, and pushing back with facts is very important. So our host this morning, Professor Adam Habib.
So thanks, Ridi. I mean, she is vibrant, isn't she? She did a superb job yesterday. We would never have been able to pull off that book launch. So really, thank you very, very much. I do want to start off firstly with a thank you. There are a number of people I need to thank, but first and most of all, Ruth. You've traveled a long way. I'm told that this is Ruth's first visit to Wits University. And so when I describe Wits University to colleagues, remember it's the place where Nelson Mandela walked the corridors. It's the place where Robert Sobukwe taught in the 1950s. It produces most of the billionaires on the African continent. And then it produces the social justice activists who fight those billionaires. And I often say to an American audience, if you want to understand Wits University, understand a mix between Harvard and Berkeley. It's got the illustriousness of a Harvard, but it's got the political flavor of a Berkeley. And so in a sense, welcome to this place. Your walk, it's really lovely to have you here. And so thank you very, very much. There's a couple of others, really, obviously, for the wonderful job. This is the second day at Wits University. She's become quite an important partner. Really, we should put you on the payroll here, I think. And then Zach Yaqub, who's an incredible friend. He's played an important role. And Zach, every time we have a legal challenge, I quickly call on Zach Yaqub. Because not only is a fine legal mind, he has important political pedigree. And I use that political pedigree as leverage, if you like, to manage the contesting divides in our society. So Zach, given the amount of time you spend here, we should also put you on the payroll. So thank you very much for coming. And then obviously Ben, Danielle, and other colleagues who are here. So thank you very much. Mugwena, thank you for coming. I do want to say two quick things. It was interesting that this is a seminar, a workshop on decolonizing copyright. And last night in the book launch, I have a chapter in the debate on decolonization. And I said there, one of my concerns about the debate about decolonization on any matter is that we retreat to where we all agree at the conceptual level. So my grumble on when we're talking about curriculum, we retreat to the point that says decolonizing means contextualizing the curriculum. Nobody in their right minds will disagree with that. But when we get to the specifics, we're reluctant to get to the specifics because that's where the difference of opinion is. And this is particularly an example of this. Decolonizing copyright is absolutely fundamental. But now the real debate is how does that happen and what the implications are. And I want to give you a case study from Wits, because what you see is competing progressive priorities in tension with each other. I've been battling with this issue for at least 12 to 18 months in this debate. I've had on the one hand argument from my library, correctly, that actually we're supportive of this copyright amendment bill. We're supportive of the demands there. And part of the thinking around that is we want to start enabling open access to journals and to knowledge that is collectively produced. And the dilemma is that too much of knowledge, which is produced by academics paid by the public purse, which is supervised by academics and reviewed by academics paid by the public purse, then it's packaged by private corporates and sold back to the university for thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And the problem is that large numbers of postgraduate students don't have access to those journals and therefore can't do a quality master's or PhD precisely because knowledge has become corporatized. And so there's a fight underway by my library correctly to have that enabled. And I'm having a similar engagement with a whole series of tech-oriented individuals saying, can we disrupt Elsevier and Springer and all of these private corporates that produce academic public knowledge? And can we disrupt them and do what was a what was the thing for the music industry? A Napster. A Napster for the academic publishing industry. So that's on the one hand a legitimate thing. But then I've had a pushback, correctly I think, from Wits Press, our publishing house. Because I've demanded of them that South Africa and South African universities and South Africa truly can never be free until we produce our own knowledge, until we tell our own stories. Because it is precisely when we produce our knowledge and tell our stories that we can be equitable players in the global academy. And I want to ensure that our stories and our knowledge is not simply produced by white scholars, as important as they are, but a newly emerging generation of black scholars who must be enabled access. And they say to me, that's important. It's important to have those authors. It's important to tell those stories. But what you also must be careful of is that those young emerging black scholars must be appropriately rewarded for the knowledge or for the writings or for the artistic expressions that they produce. And to deny them that right will deny the emergence of a new generation of artists and poets and authors and all of that. And so in a sense, they're absolutely right about this. And the question is, how do we marry these two traditions, these two competing priorities that are not contradictory, but may in certain circumstances be in tension? And it is precisely that we will marry. Our agenda is very clear. Knowledge, publicly produced, should be available to the collective of our student population, irrespective of whether you're in a rich university or a poor university. It should cross national and international boundaries because it is collectively produced, and knowledge builds on previous knowledge. It builds on previous history. So for you to take it at a particular point and say this is mine and now I'm going to charge you for it is problematic. But while we do that, we must create the enabling conditions, the political economy and the business case for enabling the diversification of the academy, for generating a new group, set of stakeholders and a new generation of artists who are appropriately rewarded for their intellectual labor. How do we bring those two things together is the real meat. It's the real at the heart of what decolonizing the copyright means. And so both, this is not a fight between neoliberal fascists on the one hand and Marxists on the other. It is an engagement, a debate between progressives on how we marry competing priorities as part of a collective project of inclusion and creating a global academy of commons. That's what this is about. And so in a sense, I wanted to say that's why this workshop is so important. So I end off by saying, please have a robust engagement. Please feel free to raise the issues. But remember, you are speaking to colleagues. We're going to have differences. You are speaking to people with a collective project of enabling a better institution, a better society, a more inclusive vision. And that's effectively what we need to recognize in this regard. So welcome to WITS. I don't think you could have had a better place to do this. This is a place for robust conversation, but respectful conversation. And I'd like you to remember that. One final apology. I would have loved, as you imagine, I've got to grapple with this, to sit here all of the time. I unfortunately would have to leave in about half an hour. When I do so, Ruth, please, it's not meant as a sign of disrespect. It is that I've got other more bureaucratic duties, far less intellectually interesting, but I've got more bureaucratic duties that I might have to escape to. But please welcome and let's engage in an open, reflective, critical, but thoughtful discourse on the issues at hand. Thank you very, very much.
We have our keynote address, and our guest this morning is Professor Ruth Okediji. She's a professor of law at Harvard Law School and co-director of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Now, her current research is what's of most interest in the context of today's event. It focuses on the regulation and ownership of publicly funded technologies, the protection of traditional knowledge, and the intersection of artificial intelligence and copyright law. We can't wait to hear from you, Prof.
Thank you so much. Good morning. It is always a delight to be back on the continent. This is home for me. And I have been to South Africa several times. I've actually never spent time in Johannesburg. I've never been to Wits. So this is a real honor. Thank you so much for the gracious welcome, the gracious introduction. I'm looking forward to what I hope will be a robust debate this afternoon. I'm grateful, I think, that this is happening here at WITS, given both the history of intellectual engagement, of activism, but more importantly, the common commitment, I think, to the advancement of social welfare and human development in South Africa. I have some slides that I can't see, so I'm just going to pretend that you all know what's going on, and somebody's going to be shifting slides, but I'm just going to talk. My lecture is entitled Decolonizing Intellectual Property for Development, Regulatory Pathways for a Reconstituted African Economy. Let me just start with what I believe is the most important bottom line of my lecture. The task and the cause of development, of creating conditions in which every man, woman, child of every economic class can together begin to experience the greatest fulfillment of their own potential, is the fundamental reason that it is important to get intellectual property rights, in particular copyright policies, well designed. In the absence of development, in the absence of social welfare, there would be no need for the kind of contestation that we see in every country whenever the question of intellectual property reform is on the table. The debate that is happening in South Africa today is a debate that is happening around the continent in different countries. It's happening around the world. And so the question, I think, for me, as we think about the role of African countries, and South Africa in particular, in this global debate, is will South Africa lead, both in its process, in its substantive provisions, in its expectations for what this law is supposed to deliver? The history of intellectual property in Africa is factually and theoretically complex. No matter how hard we try, the leading justifications for a legal framework that rewards individual creativity with a quasi-monopoly property right is a difficult concept. And yet this is the formula that has been given in almost all of intellectual property law for all of its history as a way to advance public welfare. Now, as an institutional matter, and I use the term institutions in the way that Nobel laureate Douglas North uses it, and that is to refer to norms and constitutions and cultures. As an institutional matter, the reality is that much of intellectual property law, much of copyright law, remains largely ill-suited for the kind of sociocultural and economic and political landscape that is at the heart of the modern African state. But that's not to say that IP doesn't have a role in Africa. It's not to say that IP doesn't have a role in the particular cultural dimensions of the South African economy. Comprehensive legal studies of indigenous societies have not really mapped this notion of intellectual property pre-colonial times, but there is some evidence that as far back as hundreds of years before the colonial era, there was in fact this notion of propertization, of ownership, of knowledge that was collectively developed. In some places today, we refer to this as traditional knowledge. In other dimensions, we refer to this as intellectual property. But the point is that the idea that there ought to be reward for the investment in cultivating cultural goods is not new to Africa. It did not come with colonialism, and it will not end with this copyright debate. Largely organized around webs of social networks that cultivate the ecology of knowledge, that ecology that governs most of the legal transactions, intellectual property, at least as received in South Africa and in most of the African continent, is rudely and messily pressing against ideas about enclosure and exclusion that really rub hard against cultural values and the idea of collective advancement. And yet, with the advent of colonialism, what we found and what we continue to see today is the interspersing of intellectual property norms and copyright norms that are largely in tension with many of the socioeconomic objectives that exist in our development aspirations today. It is clear that the meaning and the regulation of intellectual property, indeed the regulation of technology, is intimately bound up with questions of race, culture, and identity. Anthropologist Michael Adass has observed that technology and the accumulation of knowledge goods readily became a basis for European ideas about racial superiority. And because today access to knowledge goods is a fundamental key for personal and national development, policymakers in South Africa, policymakers all across the continent must deal with options for regulating a new set of dynamics that differ and that offer different outcomes for development. I want to make three arguments in this lecture. First, the historical framework of intellectual property, and here I'm going to focus on copyright law, did not properly account for the inclusion of local artists and local creators. Intellectual property law as we know it today, and in particular the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, the Berne Convention, the Paris Convention incorporated in that legal framework, did not think or conceive of the possibility that African citizens could or would ever use these tools to advance their economies. And this is what is at the heart of copyright and patent reform around the continent. Let me be really clear this morning that the colonial legacy of copyright and patent law is categorically not about the substantive principles. It's not about what was left on the books at independence. This is far too superficial a view of what is a highly nuanced relationship between intellectual property and colonization. Rather, the colonial legacy fundamentally is one of exclusion. Exclusion of values, exclusion of modes of social organization, exclusion of knowledge validation and of the kind of knowledge goods that come from the African economy, exclusion of a number of tools intended to facilitate access to knowledge and participation in the global economy. For example, as I mentioned earlier, traditional knowledge. There's a delicate and intense and controversial debate about the protection of traditional knowledge and goods that have been identified with specific indigenous communities. Even though much of this knowledge bears the hallmarks of formal categories of intellectual property, there is still a profound and deeply disturbing argument that it is ill-suited for the intellectual property system because of the specific norms and practices that are needed to sustain the community in which the knowledge is generated. South Africa has been leading a global conversation about how to protect this knowledge, how it interfaces with intellectual property, and to think about ways of developing tools against misappropriation. We've cabined what we think of as the production of knowledge goods by citizens of South Africa and citizens of Namibia, Botswana, Nigeria, Ghana, Lesotho, citizens of continents and countries that were excluded during the colonial era. We are now bracketing that kind of creativity and questioning how to protect it within the global system. And so decolonization is a move fundamentally from exclusion to inclusion. The second point I want to make during my lecture is that intellectual property law is complicated, is a complicated system of checks and balances. And so Riddy's call this morning about engagement and about the tension that exists between rewarding creativity and ensuring access and cultivating a new generation of voices and ensuring diversity in the academy is a tension that is permanent. It is not a tension that is meant to be resolved, because from generation to generation, South Africa is supposed to be going for what I would call glory to glory. Today's accomplishments need to be the preparation for tomorrow's. And so it is a system of checks and balances. As a form of property, it enables social and economic self-realization. It facilitates cultural development. But the focus on self-realization is a focus that fuels rights granted to creators. It does not often recognize the role of the community and the role of society in the very productive processes that the law is meant to promote. Let me quote a good friend of mine, a leading copyright scholar in the United States, who says, "We sometimes talk and write about copyright law as if encouraging the creation and dissemination of works of authorship were the ultimate goal, and that nothing further is required to promote the progress of science. We have focused so narrowly on the production half of the copyright equation that we seem to think that progress is nothing more than a giant warehouse filled with works of authorship. When we do this, we miss and we forget an essential step, that in order for the creation and dissemination of a work of authorship to mean anything at all, someone needs to read the book. Someone needs to hear the music. Someone needs to watch the film. Someone needs to run the computer program, to build and to inhabit the architecture. Copyright law is intended to create a legal ecology that encourages creation and dissemination, and it is only by having both that social and human development is promoted. It isn't difficult, she says, to frame an argument that copyright law cannot properly encourage authors to create new works if it imposes undue burdens on readers. Copyright law encourages authorship at least as much for the benefit of the people who will read it, listen to it, and experience the works, as much as for the authors who will create it, and the advantages of publishers and distributors. In short, it is not just individual reward that is at stake in the design of copyright law. The public and the public interest also has to have a stake. Why is the public interest, why is human development, why is economic development so fundamentally tied to a proper balance of copyright law? First, society realizes benefits from having access to cultural goods. Creative and informational works educate the public. They inform the public, they shape individual and community perceptions of the world, they set the parameters of public debate. There is a social benefit that comes from having rights of access and to having a vibrant public domain. It is the balance of rights with access that leads to the development of creative and scholarly talents and ultimately to the creation of new works. Now, I would be remiss if I did not set my lecture in the context of what is happening today. Legal trends that are emerging from and connected to the colonial era reflect in the laws and in the institutions, and we see this particularly in South Africa. These laws and regulations have contributed to profound inequalities on multiple levels that have marginalized significant segments of society. Technology and the technologies that have disrupted established business models in music and publishing, in academia, are not always technologies that facilitate equality without the intervention of legal frameworks. Technology can facilitate inclusion, but it cannot by itself overcome deep institutional structures. And so when we think about the emergence of the digital economy and the role of copyright law, it's important for us to situate this in the context of what is happening as a result of the legal rules that exist today. Poverty levels and aspects of the digital divide, much of it facilitated in part by copyright law, has increased in South Africa. At the same time, as digital technologies have transformed the quality of many people in this country. But what is telling is that a 2018 report by the World Poverty Clock, 13 of the countries on that list where extreme poverty is rising are in Africa. And South Africa remains on the list of countries that is off track in its efforts to end extreme poverty by 2030. The digital divide is a copyright divide. The digital divide concerns unequal access to and use of new technologies and the content that is carried by new technologies. And let me say that these technologies are, in fact, disruptive. But their disruption in Africa is different from the disruption in Silicon Valley. When we talk about technological disruption, we think of that as a disruption of business models, disruption of vested interests, of the status quo. But within the African context, disruption means the difference sometimes between life and death. Disruption means the difference between enabling vast majorities of the population to advance as literate members of society, exercising and demanding their socioeconomic rights. Now, when you think about what was happening during the colonial period, I think it's important to note a couple of things. And as a copyright scholar, what I want to do is set the framework for what happened during the colonial era. Because my last point to this morning is that digital transformation of the global economy has brought the question of economic development front and center to this question of how we do copyright law. Development has been the key justification for intellectual property. It remains the central purpose for any and all modifications of copyright law, and it is time to grapple with the colonial overhang that has influenced much of copyright law on the continent today. Now, application of the Berne Convention to European colonies was uneven. And if I could see my slides, there would be a picture of what Africa looked like after the Berlin Conference in 1883-84. Now, one of the things, of course, that you must note is that 1886 marked the beginning of the Berne Convention. And that convention, which remains one of the grand treaties of copyright law, enabled European colonies to begin to participate in the global copyright system. But its application in the colonies was uneven. What we do know is that the colonial possessions of France, of Belgium, Spain, the United Kingdom, expanded the geographical scope of the Berne Convention. Without colonialism, we may not have had a global copyright system today. In addition to colonies in Africa and Asia, the United Kingdom in particular ratified the Berne Convention on behalf of self-governing dominions. And among those colonial powers, the United Kingdom did so with no formalities in place. For all of the colonial powers, effective legal systems were essential to ensure effective control of the countries and to resolve disputes. Now, what was happening is that the colonial enterprise severely disrupted the practices and customs attendant to the system of formalities that already existed in the local population. And not only did it do that, remember I said that the first point is that copyright historically in the colonial era was an instrument of exclusion. What the Berne Convention did in the colonies was to add layers of precept to the application of local creativity. Many local citizens learned to read and write through the British emphasis on education, but they were limited only to what British publishers and what colonial powers allowed them to read and encouraged them to write. The amazing poem we heard this morning, drawing on Martin Luther King and Maya Angelou and Nelson, and drawing on the struggles of liberation, the voices of other cultures and other creators was not possible during the colonial period. Because as much as we think of copyright as a tool of creativity and reward, it fundamentally began as a tool of censorship. And that history means that exclusion was woven in to the fabric of the legal framework. But more troubling than this, the exclusion of other kinds of works, was the exclusion even from colonially produced works. So for example, in many colonies, the British government did not allow the reproduction of British materials that was thought would overeducate local citizens. The actual repression of literary works by the colonial leadership was widespread in the African continent, and perhaps the most famous example is something called the Laval Decree. And the Laval Decree was a decree that was applicable throughout much of French Africa. It required strict vigilance of any Europeans that were carrying photographic equipment across Africa, as the French would put it, wandering around remote corners of the jungle. It restricted, importantly, Africans from making films, excluded Africans from the capacity to make films. The institution of copyright formalities were subject to the Laval Decree to make sure that no licenses or registration of films made by Africans could occur. In fact, Professor Fumi Ariwa has written that during the colonial era, filmmaking in Africa was largely reserved for European directors and producers because films were thought, and I quote, to be too complex for Africans to produce or to understand. And so these sorts of restrictions effectuated through the copyright system remain in many of the doctrines that we see today. The common copyright formalities, such as notice, publication, etc., were denied to local authors, whether they were at home or abroad. But more importantly, works produced by local authors were denied the status of protected works. Why? Because works produced by local authors often incorporated colonial laws, colonial perspectives as a mode of critique. And so right from the very beginning of its introduction in the African space, we see the role of exclusion. These experiences produce different narratives, and those narratives have historically ignored the capacity of local creators to create their own copyright jurisprudence, both for access and for protection. Now, in the digital global economy, a different narrative is unfolding. In many African countries, the introduction of these new technologies is drawing attention to lawmaking, rather than simply replicating the modes of copyright protection and the features of copyright law that were inherited. The digital global economy, if it is to move from exclusion to inclusion, demands a new understanding of how regulations work. It compels us, as Larry Lessig would say, to look beyond the traditional lawyer's scope, beyond laws or even norms. It compels us to think of a broader account of regulation, and most importantly, the regulation by the state. Because you see, what is often lost in the debate about copyright law is that the state has historically been sidelined in the construction of conditions that propel socioeconomic development using intellectual property law. What is important to remember is that in the international copyright system, the focus was on the protection of rights. Rights to create, rights against reproduction, rights even sometimes against sharing. What the international copyright system left for states is how to adapt those rights to promote development and to promote values reflective of the particular society. And yet, concerns about exclusion from the colonial era, despite what is happening in the digital economy, continue to shape these legal frameworks in Africa. And so it's important to recognize the following. The colonial legacies have hindered the competitiveness of lawmaking in the African context. Addressing colonial legacies in lawmaking requires us to be creative, to adopt truly innovative approaches to law and regulations that disrupt these fundamental legacies and that allow what Professor Ariwa again refers to as the creation of hybrids. I do not believe that copyright law is a zero-sum game. If authors lose, the public loses. If the public loses, authors lose. Libraries, publishers, students, musicians, poets all have different stakes in the copyright ecology. But in the absence of this dynamic and living tension, in the absence of the capacity of poets and authors to borrow and to mix and to quote, in the absence of the freedom of press, in the absence of the capacity of citizens to consume and redistribute cultural goods, we face an ongoing destabilization of local institutions of creativity. And let me just say to you this morning at the University of Wits, the destabilization of local patterns of creativity is a death knell for the future of the generations that are being educated right here. The copyright harmonization that has produced the force of copyright law today remains relatively inhospitable to freedom of cultural expression, to diversity, and ultimately to development. South Africa, in the wake of the AIDS epidemic, in which the international patent system effectively maintained an impenetrable barrier to essential drugs, was the first country to demand of the international copyright system that there must be space for national regulators to create room for human welfare. In insisting that the lives of millions of South Africans were worth more than royalty payments, by arguing that human rights to health and life are essential features of the justification for intellectual property laws, South Africa inaugurated a new narrative for copyright law. It inaugurated a new narrative for the role of intellectual property in development. It was a narrative that said that there is a capacity for legal and economic transformation only when human capital is nourished and protected and defended. To nurture a domestic intellectual property system to foster creativity and development means that we have to be attuned to the distributional effects of the monopoly rights that we give creators and inventors. And so South Africa's legacy in the patent world is that it transformed the fabric of the orientation of the IP system for the first time in Africa and for Africa. Kenya followed suit, with the Kenyan High Court declaring that the Kenyan constitutional right to health and to life needed to foreclose the possibility of a bill that would threaten access to essential medicines for Kenyans by preventing generics. Kenya followed suit. We began to see Uganda, Nigeria, Ghana begin to talk about the importance of creating at the national level the room for the right to own as well as the right to access. Remember that the international IP system says nothing about socioeconomic rights. It says nothing about development. The conceptions of the public interest that existed in domestic copyright laws in the developed countries did not translate into the developing countries. And so when today countries around Africa are looking at copyright reform, the view must not just be a North-centric view. The view must be one that looks squarely at the socioeconomic conditions impacting wide varieties of the community. Let me begin to wrap up by talking about what has been happening around the world. With respect to copyright law, what we are seeing increasingly in the global digital economy is an effort in every country, developed, non-developed, to think about the new balance between rights and access to knowledge. The fair use doctrine, limitations and exceptions that are open-ended, all play a vital role in advancing the cause not only of innovation, but of human capital formation. What is curious, I think, to note is that within the global framework, the United States, of course, did not join the Berne Convention until it was clear that it had the room to devise a range of important policy tools that, together with access to foreign literary works, helped establish a domestic cultural industry. It wasn't just that the US was waiting for the right time. What countries around the world are starting to see is that the ability to shape rules and devise incentives for the development of local content industries without the constraints of external strictures made fair use, limitations, and exceptions important to the national experience of economic growth and cultural development around the world. Copyright, let me say it again, is pervasively involved in the core areas that are prerequisites for development: human capital formation, political engagement, and competition. Let me conclude by leaving you with what I refer to as the 10 commandments of copyright for socioeconomic development in South Africa. The point is to move from an old regime to a new regime. If South Africa and any country on the continent is going to make sense of the global digital economy, there must be a coordination between the lawmaking processes that produce legal regimes about the commodification of knowledge and those very same human rights and development interests that are enshrined in the constitutions of so many of our great countries. Flexible and balanced limitations and exceptions enable individuals, not just corporate interests, but individuals, to partake of a productive economy. The point of copyright law in any country is to give its citizens, its future entrepreneurs, its institutions more voice, not less, in the formation of their culture, in the formation of their society, and in deciding their economic future, particularly in the digital environment. So the first commandment is that any copyright law without appropriate limitations and exceptions is fundamentally anti-competitive. What limitations and exceptions do is allow the building, the multi-generational building of knowledge. Number two, no country should permit conditions to prevail that will disable its citizens from realizing the fullest cultural, civil, political, and economic capacity that they possess. Number three, there is a need to strengthen South African institutions that can help to mediate the balance between property rights and entrepreneurship. Recent history shows that it is the limitations and exceptions on intellectual property that have sustained and fueled and propelled technological advancement. Number four, the balance of rights for creators and the balance of possibilities for greater innovation must be dynamic. You cannot, every time there's a new technological frontier, run back to the parliament and the president to change the copyright law. The private debates and the public engagement that is occurring must find expression in institutions that are responsible for the oversight of the well-being of the South African economy, and that includes, most importantly, courts. It is a dynamic, not a static balance. That dynamic balance in South Africa, a country that is rapidly leading the continent and engaging the world and wanting, as I saw with DTI, creating digital hubs and engaging a new generation, requires oversight. Over time, technology and societal change will change what this balance looks like. But you must have institutions capable of providing that oversight. Without flexible and open-ended limitations, domestic institutions remain captive to only what the statute says without the capacity to adapt it to the changing expectations of the South African society and community. Number five, a non-flexible copyright system A non-fair use economy privileges the status quo. What technology does and what open-ended limitations and exceptions do is to create the need for innovation in business models. Camping around existing balances will not propel this country into its greatest capacity. Number 6, constitutional guarantees must become far more central to the debate about copyright law. South Africa possesses one of the most advanced constitutions when it comes to socioeconomic rights. It's interesting that there's such a stark difference between the constitutional debates about fundamental guarantees socioeconomically and the copyright reform that is happening on board. But the two must be linked, because in every country in which copyright has fueled technological advancement and human development, it has been because it has been tethered to the guarantees of the Constitution. Number 7, you must remember that there are fair use markets and there are rights markets. What's important is who gets to develop those markets, who gets to control them, and who gets to exploit them. But there are markets on both ends of the spectrum. Number 8, we must remember that no limitation and exception, including fair use, is merely an adjudication between two private parties. Rather, it is an adjudication of the public's interest. What limitations and exceptions do is that they allow neutral institutions to make decisions about what is in the public interest rather than reserving that decision to private parties. The public's interest, and South Africa with its history knows this more intimately or more painfully than any other country on this continent. The public's interest, the interest of the future, is uniquely unsuited for deliberations that happen only in private boardrooms. It would subvert the distinctive feature of the state. South Africa, like other African countries, cannot afford for that to happen again. Number 9, we must remember that in creating a knowledge economy, limitations and exceptions facilitate a cultural and technical interchange that every South African can participate in. The ability to remix, to reproduce, to disseminate, to access is fundamental to self-realization and to the development of active citizens. Number 9, it's important to remember that this is happening in a global context. In order to access global production chains, it is important that the copyright system in South Africa facilitates ease of access to the norms, ease of access to resolution of disputes, and the possibility of experimentation. No country advances without technological and legal experimentation. And finally, it is important to remember that what copyright does in South Africa is not going to be the same thing that copyright accomplishes in the United States, in England, in Belgium, or in France. While the colonial history was one of exclusion, the inclusion of every South African, the idea that the vision for South Africa encompasses every citizen must be central to the way in which rights and limitations are defined, implemented, and realized within the South African context. It is important to remember that in the modern debate over intellectual property and decolonization, that the essence of decolonization is not that intellectual property and copyright laws do not exist. It is that they exist to accomplish one thing and one thing only, and that is the possibility of a greater future and the possibility of an enabled community that can access technology, use it, and indeed improve upon it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. So much food for thought, so much inspiration, and so much to debate. And we will do just that in a moment. And we will respond to your inspirational lecture, your challenging lecture. And I hope that it will be made available so that we can access it and reflect on it from time to time. But you reminded me that we, as recipients and consumers of knowledge and content, are not just passive bystanders. We engage with the work, we reflect on it, and it inspires some other thoughts from us. And it just dawned on me as you were speaking that I have not had an original idea in all my life. My entire career as an author, as a broadcaster, as a talk show host, I have not come up with or invented or communicated an original idea. Everything I've done over 2 decades has been a response to, an interaction with, an inspiration by something someone has said, written, or created. And so, does that take us to fair use? And what is the healthy balance, legislative balance, that will protect but inspire fair use? So that, as you said, giving us content on decolonization, we cultivate new voices and we move from exclusion to inclusion. I want to tell you a funny story about my journey on radio. My program manager, when I first started, used to call me in every day and saying, Reedy, you are doing this wrong. Stop saying to the listeners it is open line. Say, our lines are open, call us now. Then I'd go on air and I'd always forget. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. Open line starts now. And then I'd get called in again. Reedy, it's not open line. Just tell the listener that the lines are open. Now, all over South Africa, radio shows are starting with an open line. But then I hear that it's been happening everywhere else. There is a show on NPR called Open Line. So whose original idea is it? We don't know. The jury's out on that. We'll start our debate in a moment. We'll have more speakers. We're going to hear from Judge Zach Yakub. He's going to talk to us as well. Professor Daniel Mashau is going to talk to us. We've got Mugwena Maluleke. He represents the teachers, the education sector, and I think the people on the ground. We'll get to that in a moment. But Ben Cashton, who creates all the trouble everywhere he goes, he's going to introduce the film that we're meant to watch 30 minutes ago, and then we'll get going with our discussion. Oh, sorry. Ownership.
Your 10 commandments, Ruth, were so inspiring, and I think we need to reflect on those, and definitely I think those give us grounds for a very good debate, and I hope there are people opposed to those 10 commandments who we can debate with today, because I think that gets to the essence of our debates around the new copyright bill. You said the absence of fair use protects the status quo in the country. We want to show you a little film that we made as Recreate South Africa before we get into the debate, and it was made by Tabiso Bengu, who's sitting there, which brings voices from around the country of people who are trying to use fair use to challenge the status quo, either to access their rights or to be innovators, entrepreneurs economically in their fields and professions. I don't know if you guys, if you want to watch the film, want to come sit on the front row, but it's a 12-minute film. Are we, technical team, are we able to play it now? Thank you.
I'm Joe Texas, cinematographer. I do media production. You're basically faced with copyright situations whereby monuments are protected, most of them, you know, and also accessing those monuments is a mission. Whether you're doing drone or you're shooting a music video or you basically want to put a camera in there, it's just a mission, you know what I'm saying? Because that law, the copyright law, has not been adjusted or attended to for quite some time.
My name is Douglas Scott. I'm an editor on Wikipedia. been at it for 10 years now, and Wikipedia is the 5th largest website in the world. It is an online free encyclopedia. So I'm taking pictures of these statues for use on Wikipedia to illustrate that the article's relevant to these statues, right? So, for example, an article on the waterfront. So I'm allowed to take the photographs, but due to the way the current copyright law is written, we're not able to put them on Wikipedia. So panorama, this is a panorama. What you see before here is a panorama. But what we mean by freedom panorama is the ability to take photographs in a panoramic type of setting, which is to say, sort of in a public space, and share them freely, whether that be over the internet, whether that be incorporating them to our own works of art. We are allowed to do that. And we don't have to worry about violating the copyrights. So the answer with fair use is that they're slightly different, but they're related concepts, freedom of panorama and fair use. Freedom of panorama refers to something very specific. Fair use is much broader. So fair use would say, it's assumed that me taking a photograph here is okay so long as I am not violating the rights of the author of the work, the sculptor in this case, to derive an income from their work.
What are you doing? What are you doing? You want to arrest me as a member of the international media to tell you to stop firing? Is that what you're trying to arrest me for?
Yeah, I was making a film about coming home to South Africa. One of my first big films, Born into Struggle. We arrived at the airport here at OR Tambo, and we were questioned by Reuters, and I wanted to get access to that material. And that cost me 700 Rand at the time, which was a lot of money 20 years ago, and actually 35,000 Rand to buy. The image of me and my father talking to camera about returning to South Africa.
Oh, it's fantastic. I feel really great. A bit nervous, you know. Don't know really what to expect, and there's a lot of work to be done, and a lot of people to be seen, and I want to play my part in that process.
Now, lucky enough, the project was well enough supported where I could just about afford to pay. But I made very little money on that film. It took me years to make. And I'm having to spend hundreds of thousands of rands to the likes of BBC, Reuters, ITN, AP, and all these other big monopolies who control our images in order to tell my own story.
I'm Denise Nicholson, the Scholarly Communications Librarian at Wits University. The copyright reform that is happening at the moment is to address the very outdated bill that we have. I think we must remember that universities are producers of information. They publish, they use information, they distribute information, they teach with information, they do research, so they're producing new knowledge. So we don't want free anything. Fair use has 4 criteria which you have to meet before you can copy. And not everything is fair. You can't copy a whole book and then make 2,000 copies for your students. That is not fair. If we had fair use, particularly orphan works where you don't know where the rights holders are, we have collections where we can't digitize them. We can't even get permission because we can't find the rights owners. Well, I think the large publications that we do use come from mainly America or the UK. And America has fair use, but they're not keen for us to have it for some reason. Or it appears from the rights owners that have objected to fair use. And it's probably because they're making a lot of money from copyright fees at the moment.
I'm Wandile Dlamini. I'm a student at the University of Constant Torture, University of Colonial Thinking. There are many other things we can describe this university as, but formally it is known as the University of Cape Town. I am a fallist, I'm a trans person. Textbooks are the cornerstone to many, many, many courses. Without the textbook, you run the risk of failing. And the textbooks that lecturers choose are often European or American based. And because of that, because of factors such as exchange rate, import tax, and other factors, these textbooks are incredibly expensive. So we find ourselves in this situation there. You cannot afford the textbook. The natural question that's asked afterwards is, why don't you go to the library? The issue with that is that the library is not sufficiently funded. So now it becomes this process of those who can't afford the textbook need to enter a sharing process. And especially when there's high pressure moments in the semester, such as an up and coming test, and the textbook has already been taken out. So what are you going to do in that moment where you don't have access to the textbook, but the test is coming up? So our absolute last resort, and quite frankly, I really think our hand has been forced into the situation, is to illegally copy textbooks. It is unfair for us who are trying to learn, where we copy a textbook and copyright treats us as if we're trying to compete with the publisher or compete with the author. I simply want to access this knowledge because it's fundamental to my learning process, and it is fundamental for me to complete this degree so that I can contribute to the society. But the copyright law as it stands criminalizes me for learning in an institution of higher learning.
My name's Eve Gray, and I work in the IP unit at UCT as an independent consultant. Textbooks are not a fair market, journals are not a fair market. There are all kinds of provisions in copyright and in business models and in relationships between publishers, particularly big publishers from the United States, and the consumers of the products on the ground. And one of the questions you'd ask in a country like South Africa is, surely with our students and the huge financial problems that they face, surely they should be able to get free textbooks whenever that's possible. After the Second World War, knowledge was very, very powerful. We dropped an atom bomb. Scientific knowledge underpinned the atom bomb. And the big powers realized that knowledge was very, very important and very strategic. And so in the late 1940s and 1950s, there were strong moves by the big powers to grab hold of knowledge and to control it, so that the dissemination of knowledge came from Britain and the US and from the major powers. That's in fact where it comes from. It is a colonial effort.
We should be clear that we're not here out of our self-interest. We're here because our founding mandate is to defend and advance freedom of expression and the free flow of information and access to information. That information shouldn't be locked up and privatized. That said, of course, everyone is going to be impacted by this law. Anyone, I mean, here we've just got examples of some of the publications we've produced, some of our newsletters. Very often we're drawing on the intellectual property of others, photographs that have been taken in marches, in public spaces, and it's very important for us that there needs to be a fair use clause that allows public interest use of intellectual property so that we can produce the kind of popular education material that we rely on to build this campaign.
I'm Jace Nair, the CEO of Blind SA and the chairperson of the South African Right to Read Coalition. The process of producing an accessible format first meant that we needed to get a license or a approval from publishers or the rights holders to produce that book in an accessible format. Fair use would allow us firstly to make sure that the book is available in an accessible format. And it would also allow us to share across borders. For example, The Long Walk to Freedom was produced by Blind SA, but we couldn't share that with the world. Similarly, the Harry Potter series was produced in 8 different countries. if that was produced in one country, the 7 other countries could have produced 7 other publications. So fair use would allow us access to thousands of accessible titles that are produced in other countries.
I'm Nick Hall. I'm the head of Interactive Entertainment South Africa and a copyright lawyer. I think the economic benefits for fair use, especially to the gaming environment, also to game development, can be clearly illustrated from South Africa's best-selling game, which was a game by the name of Broforce, which relies heavily on fair use to be able to remix and reimagine existing cultural characters from sort of the American 80s. That game has managed to sell over 1.5 million units. And that wouldn't have been possible if they didn't have the protection of the United States copyright doctrine of fair use, which allows them to take the IP which is housed there and reimagine it and remix it in an interesting and novel way.
I'm flying in a public space. So, hence I was saying earlier on, they need to broaden the fair use clause. I can't narrow my lens.
So, what's the elephant in the room? What are we not addressing this morning? I feel like I'm occupying 2 different planets because last year sometime, Ben Cashton, I received an email asking me to sign a petition that opposes the bill. Because somebody, I was told, may just use my work and I'll lose money as an author, because somebody may just use it for piracy, pirate it, right? That's a verb. And the debate, as I see, is far more complicated and far more nuanced than that. Is fair use encouraging piracy? Does fair use deprive the creator of the proceeds or the funds, the authority over his work or her work? We don't all have the same understanding, the same access to knowledge. So this is the moment for questions and perspectives. I love your enthusiasm. Absolutely love your enthusiasm. Is there a roving microphone somewhere? I think at this moment, Ben, why don't our panelists perhaps come forward? Judge Yakub, please come forward. Where's Dr. Mugwena? I think I'm the only person in South Africa who says your name right. I hear people making you Musutu, Mugwena. Prof. Mashao as well? Okay. Okay, let's just let our panelists settle, and then we'll give you a chance to ask your questions, all right? Oh, I see you. You're an artist, so you've got a lot to say. And I think at some point you used to call a certain talk show on radio every single day. I see you. Nice to meet you.
My name is Tebogo Statu. I'm a singer, songwriter, composer, activist. And thank you to our panel, beautiful panel. I think, thank God I'm a clever black. I just came in when Prof. Okechi was still on the floor, but I knew that she was going to say some amazing stuff. Thank you. Ready? As long as you're not applying to cross-examine me, I'm fine. The State Capture Commission. So I just want to be blunt. And I know sometimes you know, you step on toes. There is propaganda, a lot of propaganda that's going on in South Africa currently because of we are trying to amend a more than 40-year-old legislation. And for obvious reasons, people want to keep the status quo. people are using fair use, which I believe is a smoke screen, to want to block the president to assent to the copyright amendment bill. And why do they want to do that? I must have also mentioned that I'm a convert. I'm a born again and I'm a convert. Why am I convert? Because I used to oppose this bill, and but I realized that I was actually listening to people. I was not doing the reading for myself, which is a big problem for artists, creative people generally. We love doing our craft. We love creating beautiful pieces of work, but we forget what actually drives these beautiful pieces of work that we create. Hence, most in South Africa or elsewhere in the world, particularly in South Africa and Africa, creators die paupers. Even in America, Ella Fitzgerald, you can mention so many great artists. They die as paupers. Why? Because they do not understand what drives the revenue of what they are doing. Somebody out there cashes in. And this is where knowledge is powerful. And I think and I believe that this discussion is so necessary. And in fact, I was pushing for that very coalition that is opposed, that is busy mobilizing and propagating propaganda out there, misinforming artists to say, even using great artists like Dr. John Kani, great artists like Dr. Mbonge Ngema, great artists elsewhere doing songs. And they are my friends, they are my comrades, they are my brothers, they are my sisters. And I always tell them, guys, the devastation of us sending the bill back will be worse than us to let it pass through, because this bill may not be perfect. There are issues like the safe harbor, they call it the value gap. I agree. And actually, I'm busy researching that. Somebody tells me that the ECTA bill, the Electronic and Communication Act, actually does have some of those provisions. So how do we bring all these things together? So we need to speak with one voice as industry to ensure that President Ramaphosa assents to this, because I know that he did it and the ANC government did this because of the status quo, artists dying paupers, and nobody did anything. And in respect to the former president, there I take out my hat for him to actually kickstart this process of the copyright amendment bill through calling artists in Sentin to meet to say what is the problem with the industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Anyone wants to comment on that? Ben, anybody?
Thank you so much. I just wanted to get up because I've sat for so long in the airplane and I can feel the gravity of that. Let me just say a couple of things as a teacher that I think is important to put on the table for the conversation with our distinguished panelists. I think it's really important to distinguish between the politics of fair use and the reality. People talk about fair use in many different ways. The reality is that as a doctrine, fair use is actually on the rise. In other words, you're seeing countries without calling it fair use, doing fair use. Now, my view is that, I'm at home, I'm on the continent, I'm home. And I believe strongly that there needs to be integrity in the process. There is already a de facto mandate for fair use to operate in South Africa. And that is a mandate because you have a rich cultural industry, because you have a legacy of images that the world desires to see and that was so vital to the world knowing what was happening in South Africa. Everything we saw on TV outside of Africa, outside of South Africa during the struggle was made possible because some country and the media in that country had the opportunity to access those images, access those trials, go to the prisons, hear from people, look at those letters. Formalizing that doctrine simply allows investment and organizational coalitions to build around different ways in which you might even monetize access to knowledge. I also want to say that it's very important to note that we're not talking about, at least as a copyright teacher, I can say this with some confidence, that it's not one fair use doctrine. The way that fair use operates when you are dealing with media reports versus when you're dealing with academic institutions versus when you're dealing with music, all very different. Every industry has a particular modality of access. And so all that the statute can do is to create a principle that within South Africa, there is a recognition that rights of authors are protected and that rights to knowledge is a necessary part of protecting the rights of authors. That's what the statute can do. The actual operation of access to knowledge will vary from industry to industry. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind. The last thing I really want to say is this. In many cases, in the design of the legislation, not only do you have an open-ended doctrine, but you have specific limitations and exceptions. So, for example, limitations and exceptions for visually impaired persons. And this should tell us about the poverty of the international copyright system. The fact that we needed to mobilize over a number of years to create an exception for people who are visually impaired to be able to access knowledge is not, thank God for the success of that movement. But it is a travesty that in this day and age, the battle for visually impaired persons to access knowledge required the degree of tenacity to overcome the resistance to that. The case for copyright as a tool of socioeconomic development and as a tool of self-realization and as an economic tool is vital. And South Africa cannot afford to make a mistake about where it hangs its hat in that balance. My final comment is for creators. Having worked with a lot of creators around the world, I will tell you that the fundamental problem with ensuring the right to earn is a real right is contracts, not copyright. Many, many, many creators sign away their copyright, sign away their ability to really generate income because of the power imbalance in the industry. And so even as the copyright reform debate and discussions are going on, it's vitally important to ask, what do you do about other legal regimes that disempower creators when they get to the marketplace? Because no matter how much copyright law gives you, if you sign it all away in that contract, you've undercut the benefits of the public law regime.
Thank you very much. I think we do have Wits Press here. We'd love to hear from you as well. Your contributions to the debate, your comments. You're here? Okay.
Okay, so I think Professor Habib and Okeji both spoke about the tension that exists between access on the one hand and protection on the other hand. And in fact, Professor Okeji said it's a tension that cannot be resolved, right? I think from the point of view of its university press, and I'm not speaking on behalf of multinational publishers or even the publishing industry generally, I'm speaking about Wits University Press. So our mission is to make knowledge produced in South Africa available and accessible globally. We curate content, we edit it, we publish it, we disseminate it. In our view, and based on legal advice that has been given to us, this bill talks a lot about the right to access. But our sense is that in not addressing adequately, at least, the issues of what to do in case of infringements, we basically become vulnerable to our sustainability cannot necessarily be assured, and that is our concern. So you talk about the need for innovation, for entrepreneurship, for protection of local knowledge. Yes, of course, those big multinational corporations, there's a huge power imbalance, they're much larger, they have business models that are, you could argue, exploitative. So when we are concerned that small presses, small university presses in South Africa, that they remain sustainable, that they're able to continue putting out the work, as Professor Habib said, for example, of emerging scholars who would not find an avenue of publication through Routledge or a number of other publishers you could mention. So that is our concern about the copyright bill and why we raised it within the university. Yes, access is fine, but so there's an equal need for protection. And it ultimately comes back, what do you mean by decolonization, right? If South African industries cannot be protected under the new regime, we know what will happen. I mean, international industry will step in. Is that decolonization? How does decolonization relate to copyright protection?
I think I'm next on the list to make an input, so I might make a comment and then start to make my input to kick off our discussion. But I wanted to ask one thing, which is, we heard from Wits Press, and I think we should engage very much with your concern. Just interested to know how many other folks here are very deeply concerned about the copyright bills and about fair use, because we've had the letter that went to Reddy is part of quite a big campaign by something that we believe now is called, what is it? The Coalition for Effective Copyright? Is that what it's called? So is there anybody who is associated with the Coalition for Effective Copyright who has a problem not just with the sustainability of Wits Press, but with the whole approach being taken in the bills, the whole incorporation of fair use and all of that yourself? So maybe we hear a few more voices that are challenging this perspective, and then we can respond a little bit to those.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tato. I'm from DARO, the Dramatic, Artistic and Literary Rights Organization. Let me for a moment speak in my personal capacity for a moment, but based with some knowledge of what the coalition's position is. Just to build on what was said by Wits University Press, one of the challenges of fair use as adopted in the bill is that it's not accompanied by the same, counterbalance that you have that in the American version, which is penalties for infringement. In other words, you are now given a new right, but no responsibility with it. And that is what kind of tips the balance away from the producers, the publishers, the people who invest money into the process. If they're in a position where they're going to invest their time, their creativity, their resources into producing something, and they have to navigate their way around fair use without any sort of assurance of what their rights are in this process, that's like a major impediment to the meeting of the minds when it comes to the next stage of this. And just to add a little bit on what Professor Okeji was saying, she did say that the digital economy compels us to look beyond the legalistic view of things, to consider the context and the reality on the ground in South Africa. The reality on the ground is that, for instance, Wits University Press is one of the many publishers in South Africa. Unlike in the developed north or in other countries, educational publishing accounts for between 70 and 80% of what is produced by our writers, as opposed to 50-50 balance in most countries. And working from Dauro, I can tell you that over 90% of that is used by educational institutions like WITS. So you receive license requests for them to copy works for the students, and most of these license requests are for course packs, resources, and items like that that go into the teaching process. Aside from the fair use clause alone, there are specific exceptions, and there's a specific exceptions, I think it's section 12D, which permits an educational institution to incorporate copies made of your work as the creative into their resource packs, their course packs, and that will not amount to infringement. Now, if 80% of your income comes from a course pack, and there's a specific exception that says that will not be an infringement because it's for educational purposes, you have to pause and think exactly what do I do now as the writer of a textbook, as a writer of a study guide for schools. We have publishing institutions that publish only for high schools. Now, if it's for educational reasons and the exception allows it, and it takes away 90% of your revenue, how do you go on producing this African knowledge that decolonizes your knowledge system? So these are just some of the worries. There are multiple worries, but these are just some of the key ones that affect Dauro specifically when it comes to literary works. There's others that affect us when it comes to dramatic works, like a play. So if you produced a play and a school decides to use it for entertainment purposes, they could say it's for educational purposes because it's in a school, and therefore they mustn't pay for it. The same with your artistic works, painting, sculptures. To what extent can you allow your class to adapt or copy somebody's work without infringing on their moral right to that work? Never mind the right to get income from you reproducing it, but this artist created this work. And if you can say it's for education, scholarship, or what's the other word, study purposes, you can copy it without their permission. Now, I know it adapts from work to work, from industry to industry, but you have to realize that the words are there, and at some point, you as the user, in other words, anyone in South Africa, are going to have to interpret it for yourself. And your interpretation might be far from the truth. And at the moment, this is what a lot of the coalition is worried about, that it's so open-ended and it allows so much that you're never quite sure what you're entitled to gain from what you've invested. Thank you for your time.
I want to say something specifically about 12D, which is a really big deal, really, really big deal, and can see why you're very, very concerned about it, because it does allow copying of whole books. But maybe we should have one or two more comments real quick, and then we start our full set of inputs to address those and respond.
Chola Makamate, Southern African Music Rights Organization. I was just saying that you gave a very insightful, thought-provoking talk. Unfortunately, it's now been reduced just to fair use, but I just want to make a comment when you talk about decolonization, because of copyright in particular, because you make a lot of assumptions in your talk about obviously the genesis of copyright, how it's been implemented unevenly, et cetera, particularly in the African context. Now, Africa and African states in particular, those with colonial masters and colonial pasts, were colonized in their entirety. So we are structurally colonized. Our systems, our processes, our institutions are, from what we can draw from the argument, are colonized in their very essence. So how do you expect to decolonize legislation and then allow the arbiters of what happens to that legislation to be colonized institutions themselves? namely the courts, institutions of higher learning, etc., etc. I would like to hear your views on how that will happen, because we can amend this legislation, other legislations, till our heart's content. But if the arbiters are colonized in themselves, then what is the point? And I think, just to echo some of my colleagues' views on fair use, etc., etc., there's a transplantation of that provision from the US in particular, in of itself. And in some instances goes even further than that legislation. Secondly, like my colleagues have said, there are punitive measures in the US legislation which are not provided for in our legislation. Another issue is that the US society is highly litigious in nature, and access to the court system is far easier there than it is here. The majority of our population are unable to access the court institution, and the majority of our creators, in the first instance, don't understand what the law is, don't have access to the court system, don't have the money to access the court system. So you are transplanting something to be implemented in a country that is far, far different from the other societies that you're talking about. It's like comparing apples and pears. If you are looking at amending legislation and doing something with it, like you said, it's not a copy and paste. You need to take into account the context of that particular jurisdiction. And that's one of the many, many flaws. We could go into lots of discussion about the bill in of itself, but the intention is correct. We have to amend the bill. It's outdated. It doesn't take into account a lot of the technological measures and what has happened in the last 40 odd years around the world. But the best of intentions, the road to hell is paved with the best of intentions, because there's an intention to do certain things, but how it's manifested in the drafting of the bill of itself does not articulate what the intention is. Thank you.
That we start our contributions, those who haven't spoken on the panel.
I'm sorry.
It's brilliant that we have Samro and Dalro both to have spoken, and Wits Press.
I'm sorry. May I just say one or two things? I'm from the music sector. My name is Mark Ransedi, and I'm from an organization that represents musicians, and it's called MASA. We have actually submitted to the panel at the Parliament to say what we want amended in the copyright. Yes, it has gone, and I think we are not the only ones that did that, but all the changes that we wanted are not. None of the changes that we wanted are included in the copyright bill. And that it is still with the president and not signed. We, in the music sector, are agreeing with that. I beg to differ with my colleague, of which, though, I'm pretty sure here and there we agree. Most of the copyright bill is okay. But the section 12, just section 12, and I'm pretty sure there'll be comments on that section. And we feel that we are not given enough chance to actually have national treatment on the cap as it is now. I mean, treaties, yes, we do abide by them, but there should be national treatment on the copyright that should be considered. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, we're going to start with our contributions from the panel. And as I'm first, I'm going to start by addressing several of the questions that were raised. And it's brilliant to be in discussion and in debate, and it's very rare that we've had an opportunity as Recreate to engage directly with Samro, Dalro, organizations of musicians. So this is a spectacular opportunity. And I think, leading off from that second comment about the structural colonization of South Africa and transplanting somebody else's system, and whether or not institutions that are themselves colonized, like the courts, something we could debate at great length with all the cases in the courts at the moment, is a really good starting point. And it brings me back to a thought about Ruth's presentation, which is that as a colonized society, we were signed up to many of the copyright provisions by the colonial masters themselves. We didn't sign up, we were signed up to them. So who Now the dilemma is, do we want more of stringent intellectual property to get out of our dilemma, where musicians and artists and writers, particularly local writers published in local presses, are not getting what they should, are not getting the royalties, are not having livelihoods that are sustainable? We know about our musicians and artists, many of them who don't have sustainable livelihoods and whose works were signed away. Is the solution to become the champions of much more stringent and tight intellectual property without exceptions, to become almost like the poster child? Well, you know, you invented the intellectual property regime, the colonial masters. It came from laws in Britain in the 18th century. Now we're going to have a chance to really enforce copyright far more intensely than it was ever enforced before. Or is the solution to this neo-colonial, post-colonial, neo-colonial dilemma to embrace the exceptions wholeheartedly, the flexibility, to challenge the global hold on copyright and intellectual property, partly through recognizing the need for flexibility and exceptions? I want to use a few slides and a few thoughts to try and reflect on that. Are my things coming up on the screen? I think they are. Is there a slide up on the screen? Yeah, great. So I first got in, I'm a filmmaker, and I produce The Big Debate these days on SABC. And I first came to this whole thing of intellectual property and fair use and copyright through trying to make films about the struggle, at the end of the struggle, the struggle for economic freedom in South Africa. And I was trying to make a film about the apartheid debt in this was in 2000. In 2000, I was trying to make a film about the apartheid debt, the inheritance of billions of rands of debt inherited by the democratic government from the previous regime. And I went to look for footage. I went to look for footage of the struggle, for footage of the handshakes between P.W. Botha and other people, the footage of O.R. Tambo speaking in Trafalgar Square, talking about the struggle for liberation. And there was a price to be paid for using that footage in a film in South Africa. So I thought, no problem, I'll go to the SABC, I'll see how much it costs. It probably won't cost too much because I'm going to show the film on the SABC. And then I was astonished to find that all of that footage, none of that footage is owned by the SABC. All of that footage is owned by those international, multinational institutions that were up there in the film: ITN, WTN, CNN, BBC, Reuters, AP, and so on. And they wanted to charge a huge amount of money for us to use the footage in a film that was supposed to be part, in fact, the film was being produced as part of the Jubilee campaign for debt cancellation. But we couldn't afford to use the footage, the struggle footage, because it was owned by these global corporations. There are famous cases of photos from 1976 where the artists never received the revenue. Some of those are on the screen. The moving pictures were mostly monopolized by institutions outside of the country. Ruth referred to our first big fight in South Africa with this regime of intellectual property being owned elsewhere, in this case, patents. And it was in 1996 specifically that the Medicines Control Act was passed, in which we said to the world, we're not going to fail to provide what our people need, in that case to save their lives, because of your concern about enforcing intellectual property around the world. And we said we're going to allow antiretroviral medicines to be imported, to be compulsory licensed and produced more cheaply. And the companies said, no, well, we'll disinvest from your economy if you do that. They threatened us. Today, allied to DALRO and SAMRO and other organizations in the Coalition for Effective Copyright, the Motion Picture Association of America is saying the same thing, is saying you introduce fair use, you have legislation which allows more flexible, easy access to learning materials, and we'll withdraw our investment. Those are the exact words I heard the representative of the Motion Picture Association of America speak to the minister who developed the bill, Rob Davies. And our reaction as Recreate is to say we've been there before. We should not allow international, multinational corporations to threaten us with withdrawing their participation in our economy based on the fact that we want to increase access. Is it not true that in these struggles against multinational corporations that own lots of the intellectual property of the world because of the colonial legacy, that learning materials, textbooks, are the new medicines? Intellectual property, royalties, are a huge part of the global economy, rivaling trade in food and agriculture, automotives and others. And the US domination now, in this post-colonial period, of intellectual property payments is much greater than China's domination of manufacturing, the US and EU domination of agricultural exports, or even Saudi Arabia's domination of the energy sector. The US gets 40% of all global payments for intellectual property across the board. Where's Africa in payments for intellectual property? Look down the list and try and find Africa as a recipient of payments for intellectual property. You'll find it's a little component of all other, doesn't even get a mention or a name. So this is the colonial legacy in money terms that we are facing. Academic publishing is one of the sectors that we're trying to debate with Dalrymple and others. You represent many of those institutions that produce the writers and the publishers that produce academic publications. And we think that the whole system of academic publishing, particularly in journals, is a rip-off, as mentioned, as termed by George Monbiot. It's a perpetual financing machine for the profits of 5 publishers, 5 large global publishers of academic journals, who, largest amongst them, Elsevier, had revenues of £2.5 billion, an increase in profits, and profits of £1 billion just under last year. Translate that into rands. So the reality is that our academic institutions are fighting against these huge global multinational monopolies. And we have sympathy for Dalrymple when it's representing the small presses and the writers, the South African writers. But the difficulty is that you're lumping everything together. You're telling us, don't challenge the monopoly hold and the prices charged to our learning institutions by anybody, by any publisher. And we do need to challenge the monopolies that charge completely impossible prices for academic institutions to pay. And you'd think that WITS maybe or UJ would be first amongst those to challenge those monopolies. Well, of course, given neo-colonial power relations, it's very difficult for WITS or UJ, Adams left now, to stand up to Elsevier and the global academic journal publishers. And it's actually the University of California in LA and some of the Scandinavian universities that have gotten together and pulled out of this global scam of a small number of extremely large multinational academic journal publishers getting so much revenue. It's not just that those companies have a monopoly, but it's the inequality of our society that makes it possible for them to price published works in South Africa at a much higher price than is paid even in the United States. Never mind just adjusting for cost of living, before you even adjust for cost of living. So this is not, Big Mac dollars or whatever they call it. This is before adjusting for cost of living. The Long Walk to Freedom in South Africa is just twice as much on the face of the book when priced in US dollars as in the United States or the UK. And why? Presumably because the publishers, most of whom are the big multinational publishers, are only interested in selling to the 1%, only interested in selling, I don't know in South Africa, Patrick Bond, if it's the 1% or the 0.1% in South Africa that they have to worry about selling to, but they've calculated that at $20 per book, they can make more money selling to the 0.1% probably than if they price books much, much cheaper and sold to the majority of the population. So 15 university libraries spend R1 billion on learning materials. Textbooks for many individual South African learners can cost 6,000 rands a textbook. Dalro and others, Wits Press, you'd agree there's something wrong with this. We need to change it. So the good intentions, you'll go that far with us, right? That there are good intentions to change this price gouging and exploitation of learners and learning institutions in South Africa. Here are some figures we pulled from a Dalro report recently, which suggests that of the total amount collected, a fairly large amount, could be as much as 10 to 15%, sorry, 20% may go into your costs. You'll perhaps explain to us later why that money is not distributed to the producers of the books and the knowledge. But then a fairly small amount actually goes to locally produced materials. So basically, the IP system, the international copyright system that we're a part of and that we subscribe to through our institutions of learning is a tax on learning. It's a global repatriation of funds to multinational corporations that dominate our learning institutions. Now, let's go to the fair use provisions in the bill that are designed, amongst other things, to tackle this inequity. And now we're getting to the method of implementing the good intentions. Is the road towards those good intentions, is it a trap? Is there a trap? And the first thing is that in general, all it says is that excerpts can be copied. And that's based on the 4 provisions of the fair use, the 4-step test, which we can go into a little bit more detail. But there is this 12D. There is this 12D which says that in addition to extracts being copied, full works may be copied for educational use where those works are not in print or not made available in the Republic of South Africa on reasonable terms. So we have to turn that back to you and say, Dalro and the Coalition for Effective Copyright, do you have a problem with legislation that says where a book is completely outrageously priced and could not be accessed by more than perhaps the 0.001% of the population, that copying the whole book might not be such a bad idea, even if it challenges the business model of the publisher, and even if it challenges your revenue? This is the question we have to put to you, is that not both a good intention and actually a well-implemented provision of the bill that says where there is unreasonable price gouging to sell to a small section of the population, let's use exceptions and limitations to copyright to bust open the monopolies and to give you a warning shot that says, think hard about how much of the money is actually going to local authors for transformed learning materials and how much is being repatriated in large chunks to global publishers. So that's what the bill says, is that where there are works that are unaffordable, completely unaffordable, or not available at all, that's when you can copy whole works. In the music industry, the bill does a lot to try and tip the balance back towards musicians and artists. In fact, as Tusi said at the beginning, leave aside the fair use provisions of the bill, there are about 10 other provisions in the copyright bill that try and tilt the balance towards creators, writers, producers, musicians. We'd love to sit down with any musicians who feel that isn't there in the bill and discuss it in more detail. But when it comes to this famous case, just to use that as an example, of Solomon Linda, whose work Wimaway was never properly remunerated to him, who got 10 shillings as illustrated in the recent film that was made about him, and Disney has made at least $15 million. It took an archaic provision in the existing copyright legislation to try and redress that. The copyright that he signed away never reverted back to him, because there was no provision in South African copyright law that copyright reverts back to a musician. The new bill that we're trying to get the president quickly to hurry up and sign so we can all benefit from it, so we can bust open the doors of learning and help musicians and creators, has a reversion of copyright to musicians after 25 years. That's probably not enough, but it's better than previous legislation. In the music industry, you'll know, if you're representing many musicians and artists in music, that it's the record labels that are the big enemy. The record labels are the real enemies of distribution of royalties to musicians. Because unless you dispute these figures, Samro, unless you dispute the figures, you'll know that something between 60 to 70% of all the income in the music industry still, despite the digital economy, still sticks with the record labels. And a tiny bit is shared by the musicians themselves and their agents and lawyers. And even when it comes to streamed revenue, we think that Google and YouTube and Spotify and all the others don't pay artists enough. We'd like to join a campaign to challenge those streaming services, but still it's the record labels that have a monopoly on income. So we're worried about the intermediaries. We're worried about the publishers, the large multinational publishers, the record companies that claim to represent creators. We're worried about intermediaries like the two who spoke today, Dalro and Samro, because we read that you don't return enough of the money that you collect to those who are members. So we are very, very happy that inside these bills are provisions to ensure that you are democratized. And I'm sure that part of the bill, Samro and Dalro, you would support, wouldn't you? You must support a call for you to be democratized, because you represent musicians and authors. No, we'll give you a chance to respond. But I'm sure you would support any bill that says your members must have more say in how your revenues are used. Your authors must have more say in how the royalties collected are used within the institution. We're a bit confused about how Dalro appoints its executive committee or board, because when we looked it up on the internet and we looked for who appoints the board of Dalro, it says the board of Dalro appoints the board of Dalro. Anyway, just to wrap up, we think that in the bill, as Recreate, there are a bunch of provisions that are good for creators and that challenge these monopolies and challenge the intermediaries. We're calling you intermediaries, I'm afraid. You'll respond to that. And these address the right to earn, the right to own, and the right to create. And my last word is I don't think there's much debate about the right to earn and the right to own. We all want that for artists, for authors, for producers, for creatives of every kind. The debate is about the right to create, this fair use thing that bashes open, that throws open the doors of learning and challenges the monopolies. And I just want to say, how can you create without using? I think we should start all of these meetings when we are creators by admitting, like in Alcoholics Anonymous, I am a user. We are all users. We are all building on the backs of others that came before. President Cyril Ramaphosa, some of us who are very worried about, some of us are hoping that the new dawn will finally arrive. The invoked new dawn would never even have been spoken if the president did not invoke his free use to quote the words of Hugh Masekela and the music and the lyrics of Hugh Masekela. He didn't have to go and license that from Dalro or Samro before he was able to give his speech. So let's have a new dawn, and let's have a balance in our copyright regime and break up the monopolies. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just petrified because I just remember working on a show with you and that gentleman sitting there, Tabiso. We were doing a show on toxic masculinity. Did we not begin the show with Beyonce's If I Were a Boy? Would Beyonce come after me now? Oh, okay. I get it.
We went for it. Oh, but I don't know if we should admit it in current company.
Okay. All right, this is what we're going to do. We do have a program, so I would like to stick to it. And we anticipated that as more speakers put their positions and arguments on the table, it would stimulate more counterpoints and debate. So there is provision for you to respond and for you to debate. I think that let's just stick to the program and give our various speakers a chance to make their contribution. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's Judge Yakub next, right? Okay. Zach, if you could.
Timing. How much time do I have now? Because I understand it is getting a bit late.
10 minutes.
How much?
10 minutes.
10 minutes.
10
Okay.
minutes.
So I've got to start by saying that, address the colonization debate, and start by saying that most people who oppose change in any country at any time approach it on the basis that as long as it happens to others and to other people, and other people make a contribution to change, it is fine. Most people instinctively think, not for me. As long as I am not impacted upon, it is perfectly fine. Not in my backyard is the common phrase we have, and therefore everyone finds an opportunity to claim an exception to the rule, the fair rule that tries to govern them. Even murderers say that they murdered in exceptional circumstances. Even Jacob Zuma says he stole in exceptional circumstances. So everyone wants to be covered by an exception, and that is part of the problem about it's a fundamental issue about the contribution that we want to make in our conception about how society changes. And the problem is that those in power, and think about this very carefully, the colonizers are cleverer than you think, because they understand the troubles that we have about being colonized. They understand that they would like you to get out of colonizing, believing that you are getting out of being colonized, but in the meantime, in terms of their agenda. So ultimately, what the more powerful people do, and publishers are more powerful than writers, etc., 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 what the more powerful people do is preserve little interest for people here and there to keep them in their place, with the result that the whole system is designed to benefit them. And I think we need actually to understand that. We need to understand not where we are in our system and whether immediately the system is going to benefit us or not benefit us. We need honestly to try and understand the system as a whole and see how we can improve the whole system. And that is the basis on which I agree with fair use. I understand that I'm speaking as one of the judges of the colonial output, which I hope will change a little when I finish talking very quickly about the Constitution. That's the first point. Our Constitution provides, and it's a very important document, but I must start by saying that the way in which we manage society is to work out how society actually operates. What are the values that drive a particular society? The problem with colonialism, with West, and so on, is that the values which drive them, and the problems about capitalism unqualified, is that the values that drive it are material gain for a few people only. And our Constitution and our South Africa is different. We have moved far away from the colonial sphere, and I will try and demonstrate how our Constitution is important and how its values, in the short time that I have, are different from colonial values as we understand them. The first point is that our Constitution makes it quite clear in its preamble that we want to contribute to a society or create a society which improves the quality of life of all citizens and gets out the best potential in everybody. not only for publishers, not only for writers, not only for rich people, not only for the powerful people. And remember that the majority of the people in our country are much poorer than you are. They live in horrible circumstances, in townships, in difficult circumstances, where they have no toilets, no clothes, no food, no water. That is a huge problem, and all of us, almost all of us here, are in a very privileged position. We need to begin to remember that for all of us. So we need to contribute to the improvement of the quality of life of all our citizens. And our society is based, unlike in colonial society, which is based simply on freedom, and over-exaggeration on freedom, and over-exaggeration on capital gain. Our society, constitutionally speaking, is based on the values of human dignity, the achievement of equality, and fundamental rights and freedoms. No colonial outfit is guided by those values. Our South Africa is, and therefore our South Africa is different. Freedom is not all important in our society. Human dignity is the most important in our society. Equality is important in our society, and that is a non-colonialist value that is our value and our society. And then we have, in that context, the provision for freedom of expression. All of us have the right to freedom of expression, freedom to publish, freedom to receive ideas and impart ideas, which is a very important thing. You have to be able to receive ideas to impart them. There's a dynamic between the two. And the problem is that many of us, when we're creating our works of art, are very, very happy to receive information quietly and not credit those, but to make sure that we are paid for ours. So I would, if somebody says to me, okay, I am prepared to pay for every piece of information I receive exactly what they want, regardless of how expensive it is, and then people must pay for mine, I have no trouble with that. But they say, because I'm poor and because I'm the victim of colonialism, I will not pay, but they must pay me for mine. There is actually something wrong with that, and we need to be careful. There is that dynamic between receiving information and imparting information as far as our freedom of expression provisions in our Constitution are concerned. And this applies to academic freedom, it applies to everything. But the most important thing about our Constitution is all these rights can be limited. Not limited in the interest of colonialism, not limited in the interest of capital development, not limited in the interest only of publishers or of writers or of creators, but all the rights, including the freedom of expression rights in our Constitution, are limited by a law of general application, and the limitation of the rule must be consistent on a society based on human dignity, equality, and freedom. Not on a society based on freedom alone, and that a society based on human dignity, equality, and freedom is our society. It is highly inconsistent with a colonial society at any level. It's highly inconsistent with the West. It is highly inconsistent with many societies. We have a society which is committed to the improvement of the human condition. And my own view is that fair use is consistent with human dignity, equality, and freedom, and tries to achieve the appropriate balance to the extent that it is appropriate to do so. And it is not true that the balance is not achievable. Quite obviously, and I don't think that's what Adam or anyone else meant, because really, the process of achieving a balance between competing interests for the benefits of humanity as a whole, to ensure human development on a broad scale, entails sacrifices from all branches of humanity, hopefully less from the poor and miserable than from the rich and powerful. And remember that most of us are rich and powerful here compared to poor and miserable people living in the township. We must never forget that. But It implies a sacrifice from all of us to create a human society. We want to create a human society in which ideas can be imparted. The balance is not unachievable. The balance is difficult, but it is a dynamic balance. It's a different balance at different times, depending on the power forces at play, depending on how hard civil society fight for their rights, depending on how powerfully publishers are allowed to negotiate in the sphere, depending on how strong other aspects of society are. And the stronger every aspect of society is, the balance we get, as long as it is a balance consistent with human dignity, equality, and freedom, with human development, and the imparting and the receipt of ideas in relation to the proper development of our society. And I believe that fair use does impel that balance at the moment, which is to develop a civilized society, civilization as we understand it. Let us move towards that, because that is the only way in which we can contribute to a society ultimately in which we value all human beings for who they are, weak or powerful, strong, not so strong, gay or lesbian, rich or poor. Thank you very much.
And now we're going to hear from Professor Daniel Mashao. Do keep in mind that there will be a discussion and you can interact with and ask questions based on the inputs from our panelists. Professor Daniel Mashao, and he's the expert on that much quoted, I think every politician is saying this now, right? The fourth industrial revolution. Every politician never ends their speech without saying the fourth industrial revolution, and yet when you apply for a government job, you still need to fill in those Z83 forms and go and post them and go in queue and all of that. And he will speak to us about growing the information economy and how this fits into our theme this morning. Prof?
Thanks, Reddy. No, not tomorrow. Thanks, Reddy. Thanks for being invited to this a workshop or discussion. I have really learned a lot. I'm glad it's not copyrighted, so I'm able to come in here. I really enjoyed all the presentations. I've learned a lot, and thank you very much. I'm just going to speak around the issue of the fourth IR. A lot more on it because I have 10 minutes and I wanted to keep to the time. Yeah. Okay. The agenda of my presentation will be talking around what is the fourth industrial revolution, and you'll understand maybe why I include this, because I think understanding the three components of the fourth IR, which are the technologies, the fusion of the technologies, the business models, and the new values. I'll look at innovative business models quickly. I'll look at the new value systems, and when I was planning it, I was looking at artificial intelligence, but I'm not going to get too much into it. And the reason I wanted to talk about new value systems is because I wanted to link the issue of copyrights to those value systems and what the fourth industrial revolution is doing. The definition I'm using for the fourth industrial revolution is a fusion of technologies that are producing new business models, these innovative business models, that produces new value systems. I think the problem we have right now is that most of the time we think about technologies, we're thinking about digital technologies, but it's important to realize that when we are looking at the fourth IR, we're not only looking at digital technologies, we're looking at also biological technologies, we're looking at environmental technologies and physical technologies. Actually, looking at some of these technologies, such as CRISPR, on the DNA, you realize that we are really at the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution. CRISPR is used to change the DNA, and someone in China has already created babies who have a different DNA from all of us, because what this guy was able to do was to make sure that these children who were going to be born, they can't catch HIV/AIDS, because the father was HIV positive, the mother was not, and he recreated this. But what he has done is now going to be something that is going to go throughout the human generations, because
Black independent record label. I'm not captured. Mine is with regards to one of the issues that I will think I, together with others, have a problem with. This issue of this 25 years, then the rights must come back to me. We have a problem currently. If you look at us as independent record labels, we sell our rights to the multinationals with this following reason. Currently, we don't have money to run our companies, so we license our product through to these multinationals because we want to make money. Now we get abused within that particular process because we still need to pay them back whatever they assisted us with. But our challenge now is that even the bill now, instead of assisting us to reduce, I sign a 3-year licensing agreement, but the bill says to me, I'll only get my rights after 25 years. For me, there's no logic. Somewhere along the line, I create the music and hand it over to you to run with it as a major record company. But for me to get my rights back, if I read this bill thoroughly, I'm not a legal person, I'm just listening to experts. But I think even experts must be clear in terms of what is happening with this 25-year period. Because within that 25-year period, that multinational can exploit that music, remix, do whatever they want to do because I've given them the rights. But let's look at the reason why I give them the rights. It's because I don't have the financial means to make sure that my product gets to where I want it to go. Hence, there's a serious problem. And secondly, the last one is that, when we come and speak about these collecting societies, we also need to not forget that it's not only about SAMRO, it's also about SAMBRA. What these companies have been doing, and they're still doing, which I don't know how the bill is going to address this matter, they won't pay you immediately. Your money gets to be paid to them by a broadcaster. They take your money and go and invest it somewhere, make money for themselves, and most of them are white, by the way. They make sure that they chow that money. SAMBRA is one. Take that money and misinvest it somewhere at some point. I mean, as record companies, we lost about 5 million or so where they wrongly invested. But the problem is we need to find a way where we say immediately a broadcaster pays. What is a cooling off period where you need to pay me my money? Because you take my money, you invest it, you chow the interest, and at the end of the day, I sit for 3-4 years waiting for money that is making you a multi-billionaire. So far, that particular bill must also address that particular matter. Thanks.
Okay, that's the first one. We'll get to the second one here, and I'm coming to that corner there in a moment. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Joseph. I'm the digital publisher at Wits University Press. Thank you for the invitation to be here. There's a lot of noise, and there are lots of dissenting voices, I guess. But I think an interesting thing that I can't remember who said it. It's about having these many modalities where we've got publishers and book publishers and musicians and photographers. And we're all kind of trying to be clear about exactly how this affects us. What I'm unclear about is somewhere in the last half hour, we've kind of moved away from talking about how the bill will, or as people imagine it, will aid in efforts for decolonization. And there have been some tenuous links made between it on a very broad level. That's quite a clever way of posing it, where you propose an incontrovertible statement, and then, of course, you're going to agree with general principles of justice. But the devil's in the detail with this. And I don't think we've addressed, I didn't expect really that we would do it here. But quite frankly, there are just too many voices for us to be able to unpick this very clearly now. I do want to say that as a Marxist myself, I do see globalization as an extension of colonization. So the colonizers haven't left us. The real question is who that is now and how to identify that and where that is. It's very fragmented, it's very segmented, and that's not to undermine by any means the decolonization efforts that people like Wits University Press, for instance, undertake by publishing certain people, by encouraging new voices in that way. So perhaps a caution that, you know, these sort of discussions, and this is the first such discussion, I'm very glad that we've been invited and we're participating in it, but just a caution that these discussions, if they're going to be fruitful, if they're going to lead to something meaningful, we really need to have a lot more structure with it. It's great to hear people's opinions, and I'm happy to be able to offer mine. But I would look forward to much more substantive, detailed engagement.
So, where's the microphone?
Hi. My name is Bongani Mtagani. I'm a legal advisor. I just wanted to speak more on that reversion right, as mentioned by you, Ben, and by the gentleman from the record label. A reversion right is not, it's not opposed per se. It's how it exists in its current form. You made reference to that Lion King case with Solomon Linda. In that instance, that what they call the Dickens clause, it provided for the copyright to revert into the deceased estates 25 years after the author dies, which is very different to what is provided in this instance. It's very important we were talking about this needs to be a nuanced discussion, so that it's important to emphasize that. And there are some horror stories in the music industry that cannot be denied, but there are some good stories as well. And there are creators who rely at different points on publishers to help them exploit their rights and so forth. You understand? So publishers look at the number of years they can control the said copyright to make investments. So if you're going to limit it to 25 years, we're starting to go into, we're starting to encroach on freedom of contract and so forth. And I like that he's from the record industry, and he mentioned that this is starting to interfere with people investing on our works. You understand? So yeah, I thought it would be important to make that distinction.
And then we have we've taken 3, right? It was 1, 2, 3. So let's just stick to the formula and their time considerations as well. Let's go. There was a
Yeah.
Yeah, I just.
Go on.
Yeah, I'm glad about the correction, because the issue was in that particular case the issue of reversion. But when you are making that contract, you do need to look at the time. But you are not giving up all your rights. In this case, it was a case where somebody gave up all the rights. I just wanted to mention a story, again, around the issue of the 4th Industrial Revolution, about a company RAIN. RAIN Network is the 4th largest mobile network in South Africa. And what I'm impressed with what RAIN did, RAIN entered a market that was dominated by, well, I must say the 5th largest mobile network. It entered a market that was dominated by Vodacom, MTN, and other players. And they were able to do it by looking at, they didn't have any money to build a network. It was quite expensive. But by being able to see what advantages they can have in their licensing when they worked on a Vodacom network and when they worked with Huawei. So that experience for me tells me that sometimes if you know who you are and you know the powers you have, you may be able to negotiate even with the big players who could crush you at any time. Vodacom could at any time have crushed RAIN, but they were not able to do it. And RAIN is now one of the big mobile players.
Yeah, I just want to say something on this thing of being a small record company and assigning rights to a large record company internationally, or being local musicians and assigning your rights, and then that gets exploited, and when there's a lot of money to be made, you can't get anything back by that stage. My favorite movie on this is actually The Harder They Come, Jimmy Cliff in the 1970s in Jamaica, where the record company decides who should become, the big record company decides who should become a big artist, so that they can control who is making the money off the big artists. There's a couple of things in the bill that try to help with it. Well, the bit. Well, my understanding is the business model of record companies is get you when you're not making a lot of money, sign you up, own everything, and then own the mega profits once you become, big. It may be that's a little bit of a caricature, but it's pretty much the business model. I just wanted to say in the bill, so the ANC legislators who drafted this bill and the folks within DTI, I think they're grappling with the complexity of this situation. There's no easy solution to many of these things, but they're definitely trying to grapple with the complexity. So one thing that they put in there, which is pretty interesting, is this royalty sharing thing, that publishers and other sellers of work must share royalties with creators even when copywriters are signed. Now, I'm not sure to what extent that applies to the music industry. It's been put in there primarily with literary works in mind, but it's very interesting because generally in the publishing industry, once you sell the copyright to your book, the publisher gives you royalties for sales of the book, and that's it. When they license the book, license copies in an academic institution, generally, with some exceptions, generally you don't get anything as an author. Right? Whereas in the legislation, it says specifically that publishers and other sellers of work must share royalties even when the copyright has been assigned. So if they're making a lot of money from licensing or some other way of distributing your work, they have to link the money they're making to the royalties they're paying you. Now, I think, once the president has signed the bills, gentlemen from a small record label hopefully will come join us as we engage with DTI and talk to them about whether this regulation couldn't apply to the music industry as well, as whether the regulations could be written in such a way that once you see that your music goes big and it's been signed over to a multinational record label that is able to exploit it at your expense, you're able to say, no, I want my income now to be linked to the profits you're making. I'm not happy with the fact that I just signed it all over to you. I think 25 years is quite a long time in the economy today. I think if you're unhappy for authors to have the rights revert to them in 25 years, I think I can only describe you as greedy. 25 years is long enough for publishers who turn books around in a month or two these days, to invest, to make money off a work. I think 25 years later, or even less, I think somebody was suggesting it should happen even less time, that work should revert to the author and their family get another chance to do something with it. In Solomon Linder's case, his family effectively had to wait kind of 50 years because it was not 25 years after the rights were signed to Disney, it was 25 years after the death of the artist. So we think 25 years is the max. We might even be on the streets marching when they're drafting the regulations for that to be reduced, for South Africa to set a precedent that the work comes back to the author after 20 years or 15 years.
I think there at the back it was more a comment and assessment of this gathering. Is there anything anyone wants to respond to? No. I think it's fair to give Samru an opportunity to respond because a lot of the commentary has been directed at you. So, right of reply, as it were.
Thank you, Ridi. Just to say up front, I'm not a spokesperson for SAMRO. I'm actually the head of the legal department. So I will try and answer. I'll respond as best as I can in that capacity.
I beg your pardon, the representative from SAMRO was in the context of today. You're representing SAMRO,
it's
not
a play
the
on what you're saying. But first and foremost, when we engage, it's important not to conflate issues. We are conflating a legislative process with administrative, perceived or real challenges at SAMRO. And I'm going to separate my response in that regard. With regards to the legislation, we don't have the time to go through a lot of the issues, but in particular reference to CMOs, SAMRO being one of them. CMOs are a middleman, if I can put it that way, in terms of the Copyright Act, between creators and users. And there are many of us CMOs that perform that role. We administer copyright. SAMRO administers performance rights, SAMPRA represents performers who are not creators, and the record labels live in there. So in terms of your stats for that, it would be a discussion to have with SAMPRA to confirm what the details are with regards to the numbers for record labels. SAMRO represents composers, authors, and publishers, and that's the copyright in the composition. Same with CAPASO, that represents composers and authors and publishers for mechanicals. So we are the middleman in there. And the issue with the, can I finish? Can I finish? Can I finish?
Just note that. Just note that.
Yeah, thank you.
Just note that. And then
So we are the middleman. And when we administer the copyright, we take a percentage, an administration fee for that. Is it too high? It is too high. We are working, because a lot of the stuff that happens operationally, there are headaches from previous decisions that were made at SAMRO. Mr. Duplessis was also once head of legal at SAMRO. So he was also residing in a very powerful position at SAMRO when certain decisions were made. Now, because we're having operational challenges, does it preclude us from making commentary, engaging in a legislative process? No, it does not. We have every right to do so. We have every right to be in this platform and make comments. Now, the issue with the CMO regulation, and let me state this upfront and clearly, SAMRO and other CMOs have no problem with the regulation. We welcome the regulation. The problem, like I said, good intentions, road to hell. The way it's drafted currently is not in line with the Companies Act. SAMRO is an NPC registered in terms of the Companies Act of South Africa, another piece of legislation. We are registered, we have shareholders, members, we have a board of directors, we have an executive, we have employees. How the act is drafted currently is that the act wants to usurp the power of the shareholder, which is the highest decision-making body in the company. You cannot allow that. In drafting your legislation, you need to make sure that it's in line with other pieces of legislation. That is the fundamental issue. We accept regulation. We think regulation is important, but you must also be in line with other legislation. If you look at other CMOs on the African continent, what we're trying to avoid is an arbitrary body deregistering a CMO for whatever reason. We have CMOs in Kenya, Uganda, other territories where government decides they're going to deregister. What does that do? It impacts the shareholder, the member who was supposed to be acting on, for whose benefit we're supposed to be acting on. It impacts reputation, because not only do we have contracts with our shareholders, we have contracts in other territories. So there's a knock-on effect worldwide when governments decide at a whim, whether it's legitimate or not, to deregister CMOs. That is the issue that's in contention, not the regulation. That's not a problem. Now, SAMRO, yes, we have operational challenges. Yes, bad decisions were made. Yes, money was lost. Are we sitting on our thumbs, making sure that nothing happens? No. We have changed our board. There's been a change in executive. There are lots of things that are happening which I cannot divulge in this forum, in our organization, to make sure that we are dealing with the challenges that are there at the organization. I know we have some members here who will disagree, and we always disagree at every platform. It's fine, not a problem. We'll see each other tomorrow. We have an EGM, but we are working hard to make sure that we deal with those things. But please, when we engage, can we separate issues? And also, can we not do what we did here, where we come here in good faith to a platform, and it is used as an opportunity to specifically attack specific individuals and organizations. Thank you.
Okay, so this is unfortunately, and this happens all the time, radio, TV, wherever, there isn't an infinite amount of time to take everybody's question. We are wrapping it up, and we wrap it up in the way that we wrap up forum like this, with a closing comment from our panelists. And I did stop you from interrupting her, Ben, because I knew you'd have an opportunity for a closing comment. You can address whatever you wish to address in a closing comment. So let's start. Who wants to go first? In no particular order. Zach, let's start with you. You are the voice of reason here.
There is a trouble. In our country, we have made it quite clear that the ownership of land has a public content, and therefore owners cannot do whatever they want to with their rights. Indeed, we have balanced the rights of unlawful occupiers with owners to ensure that they got their rights. And if the owners of land were a company, and that company was owned by 1 million shareholders, those shareholders' rights would have been limited. So I don't understand the argument which says that there is something godly or divine about the rights of shareholders whose rights can never be limited regardless of the circumstances in the interests of the country. It amounts to rank selfishness in the extreme.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I've really learned a lot, enjoyed the discussions. I will read more about copyright as well, and hopefully add more views from the fourth IR. Thank you.
Okay, Prof. I'll go last. You go last. You are a guest speaker. Okay?
Oh.
And then Ben, you come in next.
Yeah, because all questions were directed to Ben. So I take it that there's a lot of support for education to access learning materials and for our universities and researchers. So yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. It is very important that at least we engage with everyone else, except that sometimes in other platforms we've been barred from participating. At least Recreate has opened up. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think that's an important. Okay, your response, Ben.
Yes, we are trying gingerly, carefully to draw a link between our economic analysis and of who's making money out of creative products and concepts around decolonization. It's just the beginning. Really glad to engage with Fitz Press and others about that. We hope this is the start of a conversation. Definitely can't do everything here. But we need to tell it like it is. If we're all in a room together and we see that certain parties are not revealing everything or need to be challenged, then we need to challenge them. You must challenge us if we need to be challenged as well. And Zach said it already, but let me repeat it with amplification. Should a body collecting royalties on behalf of those who are producing the cultural products of the country for distribution or educational resources for the country, should that body have shareholders? Should it be allowed to have shareholders whose interests now we have to start comparing with the interests of the broad group of people producing the cultural products and whose royalties are being collected by that body? So, is it maybe, whatever you're doing, one might even want to say, should there be anything you're doing that you can't divulge? If you're a body that represents all of those who are producing works for the nation, literary products for the nation, should anything be ever seen as private in an institution like yours? Should we not want our government to introduce through regulations a requirement that everything is transparent in an institution like that and there aren't shareholders whose needs we have to consider? But this is definitely the beginning of a conversation. Please challenge us about the links we're trying to draw between the positions we support and the decolonization discourses in the country. We'd like to engage further in that.
Why do I get a feeling it's the first time that the two views are in the same room? Because I heard we came here in good faith.
Quite.
Hold on, and I heard Mr. Maluleka saying other platforms we banned. Is this the first time you facing each other, and why is that? Just as a contribution to opening up the space for engagement. Do you invite each other at your public gatherings or engagement?
We'd like to put on the record here that we'd like to have all of the leadership of the collecting societies, together with a very diverse group of writers and producers and so on, and have a further robust debate where we challenge each other on positions and principles in all of this.
Okay, so you're not banning each other from each other's events. Okay, Prof?
I just want to say thank you. Yeah, these mics are funny.
They look like weapons.
Of mass destruction. And they can be. I wanted to just say thank you for the opportunity to be here and to listen to the really, I think, intense debate. And in some ways, bless you, in some ways I think that the process of decolonization is really dependent on this sort of interaction. A forum and a place where competing views representing diverse perspectives but also diverse industries come to bear. I said in the early opening of my remarks that copyright in Africa is particularly complex. And copyright is complex everywhere. But one of the things that has occurred to me, and I have not spent or been involved with your reform process, but I can speak from advising governments around the world on this issue, that one of the key challenges of copyright regulation is the administrative state. If you look at the complexity of copyright industries, it is vital that there be a copyright office or a particular designated institutional framework where the day-to-day market-driven decisions need to be studied and made carefully. Music is a profound example, and I say that because South African music is so vital to both the cultural consciousness and the economy of this country. But from 1886 till today, copyright law has struggled fundamentally with music. It has struggled with music copyright, with collecting societies, with the distinction between lyricists, composers, and performers. That is a struggle that is going on globally in every country. And the resolution of that struggle is not going to be in a copyright bill. It's going to be in the kinds of private public engagements that facilitate both the question of how do you share royalties, how do you collect them, and what is the role of digital subscription models. I mean, we're having a conversation, and if you heard nothing else that I had to say today, let me say this really carefully and clearly. What I do not want to see is a debate about the past. South Africa needs to be engaged in what copyright law can do to propel it to a future that is inclusive, that takes into account distributional consequences of economic decisions, and that makes it possible for every South African from one generation to the next to participate in an increasingly data-driven knowledge economy. That answer is in your hands. It is not just in the bill, it is not just in the presidency, it is in your hands as citizens, and it is vital that you do that hard work. I want to say something about university publishers, because I think that this is where so much of what happens in education is going to be relevant. In many ways, university publishers have been relegated to the sidelines because of the work of big publishers. And let me just give you an example of something. As someone who's an author, who has published many books, I have become much more invested in the economics of book publishing. And one of the things that I have said to university publishers, for example, is that there's no real contest between copyright or any limitation and exception for publishers like the University of Wits Publishing Press. Why? Because people recognize that your role is fundamentally a public role. Unlike other publishers, you are invested in the dissemination of information, and that means, frankly, that you have to be the leaders in developing business models that deal with the complexities of pricing for academic books. Frankly, most university publishers don't publish textbooks. And that's the curiosity. What's driving the debate about copyright and academic textbooks is not actually a debate that involves small publishers like Wits. And so they're getting caught up in a debate and in a fight that is not really theirs. And so again, the complexity of this topic is one that requires both attention and diligence, but also a separating of kind of the apples and the pears, as you artfully said so during your conversation. And so I close with this thought. Having a reform process for 45 years is not advisable. Having a reform process that lingers for 25 years is not advisable. There needs to be some momentum to change, a change that reflects the South African constitutional ideals and the complexities of being involved in a globalized knowledge economy. And that means that these debates and the future of this reform depends on the clarity with which there is a vision for how South Africa will sustain itself both nationally and globally as we march forward with new technologies and new norms that can help shape the future of this economy. Thank you.
Prof, thank you so very much. Thank you. all of you who contributed. I always feel the need to apologize for those of you who didn't have a chance or didn't say everything you wanted to say. And I hope you trust that it wasn't just me being a dictator. It's 10 to 1 now. So if we'd set the time for 10 to 1, we'd be leaving here at 1:15. I knew we would finish at 10 to 1. Thank you.
Hi. Sorry, just a note on lunch. We did kind of foresee that this would be a tight squeeze getting out here as there is another event coming through. Please do join us for lunch. We do also have takeaway containers, so you make sure you get your your bites worth. But yeah, thank you all for joining us for this discussion today.